Welcome to eDay7, Name the Conic. This is our last lesson for our unit. Tomorrow will be a test review and the day after that will be a test. So naming which conic it is, first thing you want to look at is which variables are squared. If it's just one variable that's squared, then it is a parabola. The next thing to look at are the coefficients. If you have both things being squared, both x squared and a y squared, if you look at the coefficients, if they're exactly the same, it's a circle if there's a plus sign in between the x squared and the y squared. If they have different signs, if they have different coefficients but the same sign, then it's an ellipse. And that's because a circle will be have the same radius. You need to have the same coefficients. But an ellipse is oval-like where they have different coefficients. If you have opposite signs, it's automatically a hyperbola. So if you have a minus sign, but there's an x squared and a y squared. The only one that I need you to complete the square on, if they're just asking you to identify, is a circle. Because if you remember when we did a circle, we sometimes had a point, and we also sometimes had something that was non-existent. And that is something that we will have to identify. That is the only one that I would ask you to finish completing the square on. Now for your exam, if I remember from your test, it's in a multiple choice format. And if it was a multiple choice question that did not have point or non-existent, then don't bother completing the square. But if those were one of the choices, then you do want to confirm whether it is actually a circle, a point, or non-existent. So asking yourself the questions, first off, is both variables squared? It's a yes, which means it's not a parabola. The next thing we can look at is the sign. It's a plus sign. That makes it either an ellipse or a circle. With the same lead coefficient, we know we are dealing with a circle. However, we talked about with circles, you do need to at least start or get going with the completing the square to confirm that it's not a special case. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you guys to pause your video, complete the square, and come back. When you're completing the square, you're going to be factoring out your GCF. And if I'm writing too fast, that's okay because you paused the video and you were doing it on your own. Looking at this one, half of 2 is 1. Remember, when you bring it to the other side, though, we have to add 3. This one doesn't work out quite as nicely because it's not an even number. You'd have 3 halves, but 3 halves squared. The idea is that you're going to be adding something else on. This side turns out to be positive, so we are okay with it being a circle. It was a point if our r is 0 and non-existent if our r was negative, if our radius. So as long as you're getting a positive, you do not have to finish completing the square. I knew it was going to be a positive, even though this was not an even number to nicely cut in half. Whatever I added on here, I multiply it by 3, and I'd be adding something else on. So I'm not actually asking you to put it into the graphable form, we're just identifying. How many things are being squared? Only one thing is squared, which automatically makes it a parabola. If it's your x being squared, it's going to be opening up and down. You can think of it that way. Here, this next one, we have 2 things squared. We have a plus sign, but we have different lead coefficients. So what would that make it? The plus sign is either your ellipse or your circle. Different lead coefficients makes it an ellipse. We have 2 things squared. As soon as you see that minus sign, it's automatically a hyperbola. And on these problems, you do not have to finish completing the square. They're just asking you to identify. For this one, I see equal to 0. They've already started completing the square for us. If they have something equal to 0, Then this, because we have different lead coefficients, it looks like though it is going to be in a just a point. Like we have a center, but we're not going anywhere. If you wanted to, you could have always divided by a number, but once it's equal to that 0, and you don't have to complete the square any further, there's nowhere else you can go but a point. I'd say it was going to end up looking more, or intended to be an ellipse, but really a point. And the reason I said ellipse is because it had different lead coefficients, but with it equal to 0, it is just a point. Two things being squared. Oh, this one I wanted us to change, please. Can you do me a favor and change this to 24 and this to 40? I changed it for next year. It'll make our numbers much easier dealing with some even numbers. I see two things squared. I see that this is a plus sign, and therefore it is same lead coefficients. We're thinking it is a circle. But we talked about with circles, and I guess even hyperbolas, we should always double check to see if it's a point or non-existent or actually a circle or ellipse. Why don't you pause your video and complete the square for me? Welcome back. I am still completing my square. One thing is, don't decide too soon. Just because you see a -40, it doesn't mean it's actually non-existent until you complete the square, because you are going to be adding things over that could potentially make it back to a positive. Now, does this turn into a positive? That is only a -10, is that correct? -10. And so it is not non-existent. Once you have that r equals -10, even if you were to divide by 6, it doesn't matter. It's still going to be a negative, so this is non-existent. But just remember, don't stop too soon with making your decision. You always have to finish completing the square, because what you add on might make that negative a positive. This we would need to have, they're both squared, but we do need to have them on the same side. And it's okay that they had the same coefficient. Once you see that minus sign, both are squared and there's a minus, what does that automatically make it? It makes it a hyperbola. It's automatically a hyperbola. Don't worry about those lead coefficients being the same. Just by having that minus sign, it's a hyperbola. This one, if we add this over to the other side, but we subtract over that 8, getting everything organized. Well, you're thinking an ellipse because it has a plus sign with different lead coefficients, but once we have a negative, that would make it non-existent. So I'm throwing in some of the tricks here. I know your test, at least the paper version, I don't know what the e-version is going to look like, but your paper version, these were all given in multiple choice format. And so if you did not see the special cases of point or non-existent, I wouldn't even bother testing it. But once you see it, those are the ones that you do need to continue. We see a plus sign, we see the same number. That would make it a circle. However, this is not proper notation for a circle. It looks more like proper notation for an ellipse, but if an ellipse has the same distance going all the way around, it's technically a circle. And a circle, this is something I know that people used to mess up a little bit on the exam. Standard format of a circle is always equal to r squared, versus an ellipse is equal to 1. So on your test, you do kind of want to keep in mind what a circle should look like. I hope this helps with your identifying. For the next thing, I want you to pause the video and do this yourself. Your goal is to put everything in its graphable form, and as you're doing that, think about what shape it is. Which way is it opening? Is it a 4P, or is it an A value if it's a parabola? If it's an ellipse, which one would be its minor? Which one would be its major axis? with a hyperbola, which direction do your branches open. You don't have to write any of that down, just helping you think and process. I'm having you pause the video and then come back here to check your answers. Welcome back. Here are your answers. These are your standard forms for your different shapes. None of them were special cases. It's just getting you thinking about our standard form. Tonight's homework, not only does it have you identifying what conic it is, but it also has you graphing these now that they're in the graphable form. That will help you practice preparing for your test. Test will be in